Thanks, everyone. I think we're going to start the next panel, which is Class 5. So I assume the streaming is working, and we'll just get on with it. So welcome. Thank you for coming. This is Class 5 Unlocking. My name is Reagan Smith, and I'm Deputy General Counsel of the Copyright Office. We're here to consider whether or not to expand a current temporary exemption for which the acting registrar has determined it is appropriate to recommend renewal. So we're looking at whether it should be modified. And I think that we'll start by introducing ourselves on this side, and then if you can state your name and your affiliation.
Stacy Cheney, I'm a Senior Attorney Advisor at NTIA, National Telecommunications and Information Administration.
John Riley, Attorney Advisor, Copyright Office.
Anna Chevet, Assistant General Counsel of the Copyright Office.
Julie Saltman, Assistant General Counsel of the Copyright Office.
Dylan Scher, Stanford's Jules Gard IP and Innovation Clinic.
And who are you here representing?
The Institute of Scrap Recycling Industries.
Thank you.
Hi, Chris Connolly, also with the Stanford Jules Gardner IP Innovation Clinic, representing ISRI.
Thank you.
Kyle Weens, I'm the founder of iFixit.
Thank you. And I guess one thing I should mention is tip your placard up if you'd like to speak. It's not a large panel, so I think everyone will get an opportunity to say what they wish to say. But if you can repeat your name for the court reporter when you start speaking, I think that will be helpful. So, all right, we'll get started.
So right off the bat, I just wanted to clarify exactly what ISRI is asking for here. In your comments, you included language for two possible proposed exemptions. One that would expand the current exemption to include new devices, and another that would expand it to include all devices. But I noticed in the language for both of those, you included a clause that asks for, that's like specifically encompasses including individual and bulk circumvention. The current exemption, which has been, the registrar has already approved renewal based on the streamlined process, includes bulk circumvention. So is there a reason you included that language?
We don't think that language is actually changing the effect of the regulation. We included it purely as a clarification, but as you said, our understanding of the existing regulation is that it does include bulk circumvention, and we're happy to leave it there.
Okay, great, thanks. And then are you, just to clarify, because you included sort of like separate exemptions, are you also looking for sort of a third exemption, which would include unlocking of all devices, both new and used? Just to clarify, that's what you're asking for on the all devices exemption?
That's correct. So we're asking for basically two modifications to the existing exemption. The first is deleting the word used so that new devices would be included. And the second is getting rid of those four categories so that it would simply apply to all wireless devices. Okay,
great. Thank you. Let's address sort of each issue in turn. So I want to start with new devices. Particularly in your reply comment, you provided some evidence of the types of situations where this exemption could have an impact. So that would be like in your reply comment, you mentioned retailers who would resell sort of like phones that had been that were, you know, that had been bought from another retailer who had an excess of those phones. Is that the only use you're looking to protect with this exemption, or do individual consumers ever need this kind of an exemption?
Sure. So we think the adverse effects are the same regardless of whether they're new or used phones. Our examples are sort of just demonstrating that the recyclers now receive requests to recycle new phones. This has effects for the recyclers and for the original consumers who are looking to sell them.
Do the recyclers receive requests to do bulk circumvention of new phones?
Sure. So we provided in our submission some evidence that there are situations where there are thousands of phones that are being looked at where they are new, and then we provided examples where deals of over 1,000 phones fell through because they were locked to particular carriers.
And is there evidence of the need to unlock other devices other than phones that are new? is there need for it?
Sure, I can answer that. The reverse logistics ecosystem is much more vast than you would expect. Retailers, I mean, so in your filings, you had an 8.8% return rate on cell phones. You see that 5 to 10% return rate on all products. And so there's not just the recyclers, there's also the world of return processors where they'll buy those 5% returns from Walmart, and then they're taking those products and they're selling them where they can. In many cases, they have contractual requirements not to resell those products in the same market, so they have to export them outside the U.S. and resell them overseas. But if it has a cellular connection and it can't be used on the U.S. carrier, then those products have a value of usually scrap value rather than functional value of the device. So an example would be a smart. I was in a recycler the other day, and I saw a whole bunch of smartwatches with cellular connections. There were brand new devices that had made it back to the recycler, and it turned out there was a software glitch, and so they were able to patch them and restore them to working functionality, but then they can't resell them in the U.S.
I just, before, I think Ms. Holman has a follow-up question, but for the court reporter, I think we've drifted from saying names.
Kyle Weens.
Is it okay? Do you need everyone to say their names before talking? Okay, we're good. So we are good. So keep going. I just wanted to make sure. All right.
Thanks. Mr. Weens, could you walk me through how the types of TPMs that need to be circumvented here and how that's done?
Sure. So usually there's relatively few companies that make these cellular basebands. So you've got a company like Broadcom that makes the cellular baseband. The lock is actually in the software that's on that baseband chip. So we're talking about a chip the size of a postage stamp or half the size of a postage stamp. It's a relatively specific lock. And I think as we've been talking about different kinds of devices, or as we'll talk about vehicles over the next few days, there's this idea that there's one monolithic lock. There's really like locks inside locks inside locks. And so this is specifically the lock is on the software on the baseband processor, which has it's the cellular modem. It's the thing that has all the smart bits to talk to the various the cell frequencies. It's actually interesting. There's almost more money tied up in patent licensing on that chip than there is in the actual cost of manufacturing the chip. It's a couple dollars in patent licensing for the 4G technologies for that chip. Which is why in the reuse market we see people will actually take a cell phone, they'll desolder the cellular baseband chip off that cell phone, and they'll integrate that into a new product. If they want to make a cellular connected television or something, they'll buy old chips because it's cheaper to take the old chip than to pay the patent licensing again.
So, and to unlock this chip, are you circumventing the same access control that would give you access to all the content on the phone, or is it like embedded in the chip?
It's embedded in the chip. Sometimes you have to break through another lock in order to get to this lock. But it's you're modifying a bit on that baseband.
Okay, and so the content that it's protecting is solely related to
is the software that runs the baseband processor.
Oh, great, thanks.
And it's a general purpose computer, just like anything else. You'd like to think it's it has some special silicon, but everything these days is a 32-bit microcontroller.
So, Mr. Connolly and Mr. Scheer, this question is directed to you. In the last rulemaking, the Register declined to exempt unlocking of new devices because there was universal agreement that the exemption should be fashioned to avoid to avoid facilitating trafficking. And I understand that this is not the kind of trafficking that's contemplated in 1201, but it nevertheless is a concern that was raised in the last rulemaking. Is there any new evidence in the record that we should consider with respect to this concern?
I don't think there's any specific new evidence about phone trafficking, but as was said, this is not necessarily a copyright issue. There's no opposition this time, which seems to suggest and reinforce the link that there's not a large link between copyright, phone trafficking, and unlocking. Additionally, as we explained in our 2015 submissions, opponents of phone trafficking have been very successful bringing lawsuits without relying on DMCA claims. There were no examples of cases where we found success under the DMCA where there wasn't also success under another kind of claim like fraud or tortious interference. And I think it's important to remember that when there was opposition about trafficking, TracFone specifically said that as long as there are comments in the record that make it clear that the exemption is not seeking to immunize and insulate traffickers, that's sufficient. The registrar acknowledged that, and I think there is no reason that the Copyright Office can't do the same in this triennial.
Do you, what would your position be on an exemption that allowed unlocking of new devices, but not in bulk, so only on an individual device basis?
So it's important for ISRI to be able to do it in bulk because they represent bulk recyclers.
Whereas my community is more doing it one device at a time. I'm also a member of ISRI, so I have a lot of friends that benefit from bulk unlocking, and I see the market need, but our need is one device at a time.
I think too, just to loop back briefly, if I may, this came up at the very beginning of this panel where we observed that the current exemption in place does include both individual and bulk circumvention. So we would be very disappointed on behalf of our client in this unopposed proceeding to take a step back like that. That would be something we're very much opposed to.
So to be clear, we're not looking to debate whether or not to renew the current exemption or take a step back, but for each modification that we're looking at, we're looking to make sure that there is a basis that the office can, decide whether there's an adverse effect on a non-infringing use, whether there is a reason to deviate from the presumption that there will be the prohibition. So in terms of extending it to new and keeping the bulk qualification, that's sort of a new thing. So I think that's why we're asking those questions, if that makes sense.
Okay, I see. So
Right.
as long as we're not saying we're going to get rid of the exemption for used devices in bulk.
Right,
It
we're
would
not
just
trying
be
to
tailoring
question
it to
that.
new.
We're trying to
Okay.
say, can you show us, and it sounds like Mr. Reams has an example of stores where there's a surplus of return goods, I guess, and other examples where there's a need such that the 1201 currently is having an adverse effect on something people want to do, because if there's not a need to do it or desire, then the presumption is that the prohibition on circumvention maintains.
Right. So another example would be around we're seeing every home security or commercial security device has some kind of telephone connectivity, so it can phone home if it's being broken into. And we're also seeing in this rapid pace. I mean, every year the smart home marketplace changes. So last triennial we discussed Revolve, which was a smart home system that Nest bought. After Nest bought them, they shut the servers down. So you can very easily imagine a situation where you have a home security system, a company shuts it down, they're not supporting it anymore. A recycler is going to end up with the 10,000 remnant units. Can't use them with the original cellular connectivity, but may be able to swap out the SIM cards, use one of the open carriers, and then resell the devices.
Is it not possible in that example to get permission to go from one carrier to another?
Yeah. So the surprising thing about what recyclers do is that they never interact with the manufacturers. So even if let's say these smart home systems are sold at Best Buy. Best Buy may have the contract with Nest or Google, and they're buying those things. But then when Best Buy is done with them, or they get all these returns, they'll give them to a return processor or to a recycler. That processor has no contractual relationship or commercial relationship in any way with the manufacturer or the carrier. And so they wouldn't have a business relationship. They wouldn't have any leverage to be able to say, hey, I've got all of these 10,000 smart home systems that would be very valuable to me. Why should the manufacturer give them the unlock codes? So the incentive is in the manufacturer's favor to take those devices off the market entirely. It's in the recycler's best interest to unlock them and resell them.
In the scenario you're describing, is it the manufacturer who has the unlock codes or the carrier, or both?
Either.
I have a question to probe a little bit more on the example that you're using. It would seem to me that if a product was purchased and went out of the store and was returned to the store, wouldn't that be classified used under the current exemption?
So it would not, for the purposes of copyright law, used is specifically defined as having been previously connected to a wireless network. So that's one of the problems we run into, is that if these devices are returned without having been connected, they are for 1201 purposes new devices.
So in the, let me probe just a little bit more on that. In the previous exemption, there was a definition of used, right? Used for purpose of this exemption when it has previously been lawfully acquired and activated. So you point to the second part, but what if we eliminated that second section and just said lawfully acquired, rather than just say new or used, but it's all lawfully acquired wireless devices? Would that satisfy your clients in this case?
I think that would be a change we'd very much like to see, yes. I don't think that would get quite everything our client wants to see, but we certainly do think that would be a positive step.
Can you give me an example of something that would not be covered that you think should be by that language?
I cannot come up with an example.
Can you give me
offhand.
the full sentence that you're imagining?
Sure. It's so right now it says used for purposes of this exemption when it has previously been lawfully acquired and activated on a wireless telecommunication network. So we would eliminate the second half. So it's never been activated, but it's been lawfully acquired. So it seems to me that the transactions you're talking about are lawfully acquired transactions, right? So you're going to Best Buy, a reseller is going to Best Buy, they're acquiring these in bulk, or a handful of them even, and then they're repurposing these. So it seems to me, does that fit the definition you think is lawfully acquired?
I think, yes, I think it does. And insofar as our concerns are associated with the reverse logistics industry, I think that would solve our clients' concerns.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I think that definitely works as long as it's clear in the exemption that that's not necessarily the definition of used, because I think that is just sort of confusing in terms of plain language. Because if you get a child a gift for Christmas and you don't open it, and then on Christmas Day they open it, they wouldn't say thank you for the used Xbox. So as long as it's clear that that's what the definition means, and maybe it's not the definition of used, but the definition of what's being acceptable in the exemption, I think that's fine.
Right, so you could imagine perhaps the language, instead of saying used, should say lawfully acquired, right? Because it would be directly substitutable, right? So that could be potentially the language of the exemption rather than used or new or just all devices, just say lawfully acquired devices.
I think that makes sense.
Okay, let's move on. Let's move on to all devices. So in your comments, you talk about various types of devices, and it would be helpful for us to go through each of these types of devices and get a little bit more evidence on the record about sort of the types of TPMs at issue, the adverse effects of the current exemption, potential non-infringing uses. So let's start with child monitors. Mr. Wiens, do you have experience with these devices?
Well, they're similar to security systems, so
Okay.
I've lumped them into the same kind of boat. Or, I mean, I have a friend who has a ranch. He has a game camera with a cellular connectivity, and so every time a critter walks by, every time a deer walks by, it texts him a picture of the deer.
I actually have a question. The child monitors in the written proceedings are apparently sold in the form of a watch or an amulet. So why isn't this already permitted as a wearable device in the current exemption? I didn't think that was a very useful example, since it doesn't seem to be something that you need a new exemption for.
I haven't seen where you may.
Well, maybe this is more dedicated towards ISRI, what you meant when you said child monitor or tracker. Maybe that's different than what Mr. Wiens is describing.
Right. So I would concede that child monitors that come in the form of smartwatches are included in the current exemption. I think possibly are examples of some of the automobile GPS trackers we also discussed in that same section are better examples on that point.
Okay, let's start with those then. So my first question about those types of devices is, sort of just like, I'm trying to understand exactly what type of device you're talking about. Are these like devices that are part of the car? Like when you buy the car, it comes with like an OnStar system, for example, or are you contemplating a separate device that you would buy separately and like add on to your car?
So these are separate devices, and we give two examples. We have Sync Up Drive, which is T-Mobile's device, and we have Verizon's Hum, and those are standalone devices you would buy for addition to an existing car.
Okay, and when you buy the device, do you contract directly with like T-Mobile, for example, and to obtain a cellular plan for this device? How does that work?
It's not clear to me exactly how that would work in terms of whether it could possibly be added to an existing plan or you could contract for a plan for that. But the important thing to keep in mind for us is we have nothing to say about contract. Basically, the exemption we're asking for would not in any way impair the contract rights that a carrier might have. All we're asking is that if a consumer were to have the occasion, or a recycler were to have the occasion of wanting to unlock these devices, they could do so without being in violation of the DMCA.
So I think a question is we need to know it is possible to unlock it and go from one carrier to another. Because if it's not 1201 that is the cause of the use that is sought to be made at the exemption we're granted.
There's no, I mean, we're using standard cellular networks. So the only thing that limits it to one carrier or another is the baseband's lock on the cell carrier's signal. But from a technical perspective, any cellular device that can talk on 3G can talk on anything as long as you're talking on it's got the frequencies built in. It's going to be more limited by the frequencies, but there are almost every carrier. There are multiple carriers on any given frequency.
So you're saying essentially, if you could unlock one of these devices from T-Mobile, say, and you have a cellular plan with AT&T, you'd be able to connect it to your cellular plan without sort of adding anything to your AT&T plan.
Well, whether AT&T would let you, but yes.
I mean, I guess that's sort of a question that we need some evidence
right.
on.
Well, so what we're seeing is all the cell carriers are excited about IoT because it's more data that they can charge people for. So if you have a device that you want to connect to any carrier that's going to transmit data, they're happy to take your money to connect the device to it. From a technical perspective, absolutely anything that has cellular connectivity can be switched from one carrier to another. If there's a baseband lock on it, you have to bypass that lock, and then you can. Will another carrier welcome you? Absolutely.
Go ahead.
I mean, can any of you tie that into the automobile, truck, or train example?
Yeah. Where we're seeing these GPS trackers happen, I mean, everybody is excited about them, is the insurance companies are paying for it because the insurance companies can get a device in your car and track your usage. Then they can profile you. They can say you're a risky driver or you're not a risky driver. So you see there's a teen drivers a lot. You have a 16-year-old, they're going to give you a discount on your car insurance if you put a tracker and it's phoning home on how hard they're braking. But you can imagine your kid turns 18, you don't want that anymore. Maybe you switch insurance carriers. Your new insurance carrier is using Verizon instead of AT&T. They're going to charge you for another device. If you could switch the device that you had that you're not using anymore to the new carrier, that would be beneficial.
Do you know if that has happened? Like, is there a refusal to switch carriers in the example of the car tracker for insurance purposes?
I haven't seen that yet. I mean, this is a relatively new category, and these devices, I mean, it's only in the last, 6 months or a year that both T-Mobile and Verizon have been pushing these devices really hard. So I think we're anticipating where the market's going to be going over the next year or two. But the market moves so quickly that I can see a lot of it. It's going to end up, you're going to end up with hardware being abandoned. It's kind of like your DSL modem. You know, you sign up for a plan with Charter, and then you move and you want to use the same modem with Comcast, and they won't let you. There's nothing different about the modem. You just want to be able to switch it over.
Right, and to Mr. Ween's point about how fast this is moving, as we were preparing our reply comment in January, so we're only talking 3 months ago, T-Mobile launched what it bills as the first nationwide NB-IoT plan. So this happening just 3 months ago, it's very, very difficult to come before the Copyright Office and say, here's a list of examples of consumers who've been in this position and haven't been able to switch carriers. Our concern, and the reason we believe it is very important that this exemption be granted now, is that this is moving so incredibly fast that if people have to wait 3 years, it's going to stifle innovation. We've seen studies suggesting that by 2021, there'll be over 900 million things connecting to the IoT only using cellular technology. That's not including Bluetooth or Wi-Fi or anything of this sort. And there was an AT&T white paper, actually, that came out just last year, 2017, starting out by observing that virtually anything can be connected to the internet. Well, if we take that seriously, and that's not on our say-so or ISRI's say-so, that's on AT&T's say-so, it doesn't seem reasonable that people of all these kinds of devices, virtually anything, will have to wait every 3 years and separately come before the Copyright Office with their GPS trackers or their widget makers or whatever the case may be.
But it's different, right? Because a lot of those things might connect to the internet, which might not involve the type of unlocking you're asking for here. Like, I was actually going to ask, are these sort of GPS tracking devices, can they connect via Bluetooth or via like a wireless internet or a network you create on your cell phone? Is there a way to sort of like get around this issue without having to trigger the exemption?
They tend to be very simple devices that don't even have screens or buttons. You just put the SIM card in and plug it into your car. So and just from a cost perspective, they're not going to want to put a Wi-Fi chip or a Bluetooth chip on these devices. So in terms of the car trackers, they'd only talk on the cellular network.
And I'll just add, I don't think there is any evidence or reason to believe any of the reasons that the register has acknowledged that voluntary unlocking from carriers might not be accessible to consumers, that there's any reason why that analysis would change for these GPS trackers.
Well, that was based on an extensive record. So I think we're also looking to see some examples that there's a competitor to T-Mobile, for example.
Well, in terms of the GPS trackers, we put in multiple devices that go in cars. And we provided you the evidence about child trackers, although we acknowledge that those are wearable devices to demonstrate that parents have an interest in changing their carriers for things that are focused on child safety, like these car trackers. So we don't have specific examples that demonstrate to you, here's somebody who wanted to change their Verizon hum and they were unable to. But there's little reason to think that the voluntary carrier unlocking would be sufficient, especially now that we just have the recently announced DOJ investigation suggesting that there's collusion between some major carriers in terms of trying to make it harder to unlock from carriers.
I don't know if you saw that story. The story came out on Friday that the FTC has launched an investigation into the eSIM development process that's happening through the GDSM Association, and the FTC is accusing AT&T and Verizon and maybe some of the other carriers of colluding and preventing competition in the marketplace. So this has actually got the manufacturers that we suspect are behind this FTC complaint saying, hey, in the technical process of developing eSIM, which is just a virtualized software SIM card, that they're seeing anti-competitive practices.
Is that related to whether or not they would allow unlocking to go from one carrier or another? Because I had thought that there was sort of some voluntary cooperation to promote that, at least in the smartphone market.
Yeah, no, this is very specifically solely related to the ability to move from one carrier to another. So the development of the eSIM, we're moving from a physical SIM card to a virtual SIM card. The carriers want to continue to be able to have the same kind of locks that they have now, and clearly there's been disagreement in the standards development process over how that happens.
So are you considering eSIM a TPM, or is eSIM a separate sort of obstacle to
I would
unlocking?
consider the TPM to be at the baseband layer and the SIM card or the eSIM to be underneath that.
So if the eSIM would prevent unlocking, does that help you or hurt this exemption if you're also stopped by that?
I would think that this exemption would cover unlocking the baseband, whether the baseband was identifying the cell carrier via SIM card or an eSIM. So my interpretation of how it would work is that this would sit over the top of whatever kind of TPM.
I guess what I'm getting at is we've said one thing we're looking at is whether the prohibition on circumvention has a causal relationship to the adverse effect. And if the eSIM is separately preventing unlocking, that may not be the case.
I don't think it would be separate. I think it would just be another way of implementing it.
I also gather that's new technology.
It's relatively new, but you have, Google's new phones have eSIM. I haven't dived into enough of the detail of how eSIM is built, but my guess is that a circumvention of a eSIM TPM will be the same as a circumvention of a SIM TPM. It's the TPM is on the baseband, and the SIM is just what's telling the baseband what signals to be looking for.
I just want to clarify, I didn't raise that to suggest that there's eSIM in the GPS trackers. I was just providing that as updated evidence that voluntary carrier unlocking might be insufficient, aside from the previous reasons that we'd written about in our past submissions, such as it being a very complex process and that major carriers have escape hatches where they might not unlock your phone even if you meet all of the necessary requirements.
Is there evidence in the record of that happening?
So that was from our 2015 submissions where we dove more into that issue, where we explained why voluntary carrier unlocking was not necessarily sufficient in terms of used phones. So we didn't re-go through all of that analysis in our 2018 submissions. But yeah, I can point you to the specific pages where we made those arguments.
Well, and the register declined to grant the exemption you were asking for.
No, in 2015.
With respect to all devices.
Well, in 2015, we were focused explicitly on used phones.
Okay.
And the register also acknowledged that consumers may have trouble taking advantage of voluntary carrier unlocking policies because of the conditions imposed by certain wireless carriers. That was on page 165.
So I just have one more question on the eSIM since it's new, and then maybe we can go to some of the other categories. But are you saying if you circumvent the TPM that is protecting an eSIM, you will be able to successfully unlock a device?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, thank
you. Relatedly, and this might be just a short question, but the tracking devices in trucks and trains, do those operate the same way that the car devices do?
And I also think talking about OnStar as well would be helpful, because I think the GPS tracker that you connect to your car is separate from OnStar. So your initial comments for Isri talked about OnStar, and then the reply talks about the trackers.
Yeah, right. Well, so okay, let's handle OnStar first. So
maybe can we do that second? I think that one's more complicated.
Okay.
Sorry if I...
No, that's okay. Let's do trains and trucks first.
We're going to get to crop seed and soil monitors.
Yes.
Think about
I was waiting for that.
All right. So you guys want to take that?
So trains and trucks, I don't believe we have much information on record about trains and trucks. We would simply include those as a couple examples of the broad utility that the IoT does have. And to the extent that those technologies do connect to wireless telecommunications network, that's really what we kept returning to as our touchstone, is that we want to cabin our exemption not according to trucks in, trains out, cars in, some arbitrary classification, but trackers that do connect to telecommunication networks.
I think the category of product you're looking at there is a fleet management system. where you'd have a moving truck company, they have 200 trucks, and they want to put trackers in, or I mean, all of the long haul trucks use this, where they actually have remote speed limiters so that their drivers can't go past 65 miles an hour on the freeway. Those are all, I think, in this category of device.
And those are built into the vehicles?
Those are aftermarket devices that are added on to. Generally, they're aftermarket.
And is there a need to switch the carrier for those types of devices?
Let's say I'd put it in the same category as something. Let's say you bought 200 of these for your semi-truck fleet, and then you want to switch software companies and like keep your hardware. You can see how maybe the new company has an arrangement with a different carrier. It's hypothetical. I don't have a specific fleet management friend.
Okay. Is it clear that the fleet management company in this hypothetical situation has purchased the built-in cellular modems? Are they leased?
Yeah, good question. I'm familiar with, I think, both models, where sometimes it's just provided as part of a monthly service that you're paying, and they bundle the hardware and the cellular connectivity and all as one, and then others where there's a device that you're buying.
All right, so let's move on to the OnStar systems. I just want to clarify again, is this an add-on product or because I know some cars do have like integrated OnStar systems. Are you asking with respect to those as well?
So yes, I mean, we're talking anything with a cellular device.
That's correct. That would include automobiles. We really don't see why it should be a violation of the DMCA if all that's being done is unlocking to switch carriers. We're not talking about anything else, any other tampering or jailbreaking or hacking, only unlocking to switch carriers.
But to get to be able to unlock to switch carriers for an integrated OnStar system, would you have to circumvent sort of like the car, because like cars have many layers of software now. Mm-hmm. Would you have to sort of circumvent some of the other layers of the car's software to get to what you need to do to unlock to connect to the carrier?
Potentially.
Okay, and I mean, by unlocking those systems, could you potentially have access to the car's entertainment system?
The way that it's interesting, if you think about all the things that a car wants us to talk on a cellular connection for, it wants to talk for the purposes of an OnStar type, like driver assist. It wants to talk for the purpose of providing a Wi-Fi hotspot, potentially for downloading new maps. And so the vehicle manufacturers, the way it has worked out is instead of having 3 or 4 separate cellular modems in the car, they have one, and that one almost always lives in the telematics and entertainment module.
Okay, so it sounds like it's possible or likely that you would have to unlock the telematics and entertainment system module to get to unlock to switch carriers for the OnStars.
That's possible.
Okay. And I mean, we'll talk about this more on Wednesday in the repair section, but in that exemption, there's been a lot of evidence regarding whether or not unlocking those systems both exposes creative content to infringement and also could create security concerns.
Right.
So can you speak to that?
Yeah, well, I would say let's focus on specifically what we want to accomplish, which is you have a car that is locked. Let's say it's got a Wi-Fi hotspot and it's locked to a carrier. Should consumers be able to bypass the TPM to do that? I would say yes. Now, is it possible, or can it be possible for car manufacturers to design these things in such a way that you can bypass that lock without bypassing the other locks? I would think absolutely. So if there is a side effect that there's a security challenge or that there's another lock that you have to bypass to get to it, that's a result of the vehicle manufacturer's decision to design the product.
So when you're the owner of a car that has OnStar, you have to pay your carrier, AT&T, Verizon, whomever, to use OnStar?
You pay GM for the OnStar service, and then GM is paying the carrier. For a hotspot, which almost all new cars these days have Wi-Fi hotspots built into them, you're paying the carrier. and you may not have options on which carrier that your car is talking to, depending on how. So, for example, I just rented a car. I pay ungodly amounts of money every month for cellular service, including for various devices. I rent a car. It's got a Wi-Fi hotspot. Wi-Fi hotspot doesn't work. There's no way for me to get that Wi-Fi hotspot. Even though I've got a SIM card I could put in there, there's no way for me to get the Wi-Fi hotspot in my rental car working. And this is true across almost every car that's being rented in the U.S. They have Wi-Fi hotspots that are not functioning.
And why does it not work?
Because I have I don't have a way of putting my SIM card from a different carrier than whatever carrier that car is locked to. There's literally a SIM card inside that you pop the engine and stick your SIM card in.
Go ahead.
To say maybe a rental car is not the best example.
Potentially, because I don't know that. Yeah, I feel you. But you see you imagine I buy a car, it's locked to Verizon, and then I want to sell it to somebody in Canada, or I want to go and work in Canada for a couple of months. There's no Verizon in Canada. I'd have to unlock it and move it to Rogers. So it's changing the value of the device. Same thing as all the arguments about the value of cell phones in the aftermarket. Value of vehicles in the aftermarket is going to be dependent on whether the cellular connectivity can be changed from one carrier to another.
Actually, I had a question about that. Before you had mentioned that the difference between being able to switch SIM cards or not is the difference between a device being usable and it being recyclable as scrap. But there's an example in other proponents' reply comments where it talks about a price differentiation between you get more money if you can put it on a different network. Which one is more accurate? Is it Mr. Wine saying that if you can't switch networks, the device is going to be scrap, or is it there are different networks and you get different prices when you recycle them? Which one is kind of a better example?
Well, I think it depends on the situation. Like the example about moving to Canada, that's a device that wouldn't be usable in Canada, but
I'm talking about the recycling context, though.
The recyclers have a kind of economic threshold that the device has to be over. So let's say that a Sprint device is going to be worth 25% less than a AT&T device. If that 25% is now below the threshold of what it costs them in labor to process the device, that's when it would move into the scrap pile compared to resale.
I appreciate that. I wonder if we could get any
Sure.
response from the recycler.
No, that's accurate. We provided one example where a sale for T-Mobile phones couldn't go through because it was locked to a T-Mobile device.
Okay,
So
and it wouldn't go through at a price, or it wouldn't go through at all.
it was not profitable enough for the recycler, so he had to decline the deal, and those devices were then not resold, as far as we know.
Right, that's my understanding as well. So I think what Mr. Weens has just told you is entirely consistent with what we said. That example is on our page 1. It's Joe Clayton of Arcoa, and there just wasn't enough money in the deal for him that the whole deal fell through. So my understanding is what happens when there's not enough money in it for a recycler, it's then scrapped. So I think we're telling you two sides of the same thing.
And I think you understand the nature of my question about what the adverse effect is different if you can't use it at all in a recycling setting versus if you can't use it can't sell it for the price you want.
Well, perhaps I'm just not quite following, because in the recycling setting, if the recycler can't get an adequate price to let him turn a profit, then the recycler can't do anything with the phones at all.
And you're saying that for these other devices, that would be a common problem?
Like that would be, or that will certainly become within the next 2 years, as we're heading rapidly toward 900 million plus connected devices by the time the next triennial is convened.
One more question about OnStar. Mr. Weens, you said that the contract that provides connectivity to an OnStar device is probably between GM and a carrier. So by unlocking, you're cutting GM out of the equation. Is that sort of how? So you would no longer, if you were unlocking your OnStar device, you would no longer pay GM for that service. You'd be paying another wireless carrier directly. Is that how it works?
Or someone like AAA. The AAA would like to compete with GM on OnStar, and they'd like to replace the OnStar button with a AAA button. And then you'd be paying AAA, and then whichever cellular carrier that AAA negotiated with.
Sorry, how would they replace the button?
Well, they just make. So that would be. This probably has more to do with what we'll talk about on Wednesday, but the idea is, you've got this telematics feed. We're very quickly going to break outside today's discussion. The telematics feed is piped to GM, and then they're providing it to their network of service centers. And in the case of the OnStar button specifically, because it's a service-related function, then that would be piping it to AAA and their roadside assistance.
And so your testimony is that if I buy a car where the car's Wi-Fi requires me to have a subscription to AT&T, but my phone or home subscription I use Verizon, I can't switch it to Verizon without unlocking it.
Right.
I guess the question is this really going to be useful for OnStar? Because OnStar is a little bit of a different example in that it's a service, right?
Yeah.
OnStar is a service.
Yeah. I would focus on the Wi-Fi hotspot. I think that's more relevant to this exemption of what you would want to be. It's almost every car has Wi-Fi hotspot, and then you can tack onto your data connection. And you can imagine the consumer would want to have one wireless bill, not two. And they want it to be with whatever their existing carrier is, not whatever the contractual, whatever the...
And does that work the same as OnStar, where if you buy a GM car, you pay GM for the connectivity of the Wi-Fi?
No, in that
hotspot?
case, you're paying the carrier directly.
Okay. So,
I think.
why would you need to circumvent to switch carriers in that case?
Some of them are locked too. So GM says, "Hey, you buy our car, and you can have wireless service through Verizon." It's like if you buy a iPad that's locked to Verizon. It's the same,
I see.
It's the same deal. You buy the iPad from Apple, it's locked to Verizon. You pay Verizon by the month. If you can unlock it, then you can use it on AT&T, but it came locked.
I see.
So you describe the TPMs as like locks upon locks upon locks. Where's the lock for the Wi-Fi in the car? Where does that sit?
It's the same as it's at that baseband processor level. It's the same lock.
So if you unlock it, does that get to the telematics system? Does that get to OnStar, or is that something?
Well, this comes down to the design of the vehicle and the design of the system. So it's going to depend on which infotainment system that you're talking about. The hope would be that you could narrowly just unlock the baseband and not touch the rest of the vehicle. Like that would be because I'm just I'm an engineer. I just want to move my car from one area to another. So I prefer not to impact the rest of those locks.
Do you have any sort of concrete examples of cars where it's possible to do that?
I don't.
Okay. Regarding sort of the Internet of Things, which we've sort of touched on a little bit, how many of these devices, I know there are countless devices, and we don't have time today to go through every single one of them, but how many of them only connect to cellular data and don't connect to Wi-Fi, that your average consumer uses? Can you give me just sort of a sense of the landscape?
Sure. So as of 2015, there were 265 million devices connected to the IoT by cellular technology only, not including Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, whatever. And that number I cited earlier, 910 million by 2021, that likewise is analyst projection of devices that will connect by cellular technology.
And can you give me some examples of devices that we haven't talked about yet today?
Devices that we haven't talked about today, I know a lot of them might be industrial IoT. It's hard for me to talk specific devices, but manufacturing devices is one thing. And just the other examples we listed, you could imagine even something like bridges and tunnels. And when, I don't want to speculate too much, but these are all things that anytime someone or a corporation, a municipality, whatever, might want to monitor what's going on with a particular device, a particular place, whatever, those are potential applications for the IoT.
Mr. Weens, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, traffic lights oftentimes have so they can phone home if they're having a fault. I have a friend that is building a internet. He does telemetry on natural gas pipelines, and they found that the cellular connectivity was too expensive, so they're building an alternative mesh network for getting their telemetry off. So the cost and the availability of IoT data is significant. There are cell carriers like Ping is a virtual MVNO cell carrier where they sell SIM cards. It's Ting, Ting. They purely sell, they resell the data from I'm not sure which of the main carriers, and they're only targeting IoT devices. And so you can go and you can get a SIM card from them effectively for free, and then you just pay by the megabyte for how much information that you use. And their entire business model is predicated on a wide spectrum of these devices coming out. I mean, yeah, we can talk about more examples, and in 3 months there will be more examples. Like this is we're at the base level of a power law curve here.
We hear there are a lot of things in the Internet of Things for sure. We're not contesting that, but in these examples that you've talked about, bridges, natural gas pipelines, or traffic lights, it's who owns them?
Well, in the case of the natural gas pipeline, it'd be the natural gas company or the Halliburton that's doing the installation.
Well, then they're probably not wanting to unlock them, are they? It's the lessee.
I mean, it comes down to flexibility. So maybe when you buy them initially, they're locked. I don't know. I mean, it's always.
I think they're very large and expensive, and
Yeah,
there's
sure.
complicated transactions.
Right. Are they going to come locked, or is it going to be unlocked? I don't know. That depends on the decision that the manufacturer makes at the time. You can imagine that they want to bundle. A typical business model is to do what GM is doing with OnStar and to bundle the cellular connectivity with the service that they're providing. And then in order to be able to move from one service to another, you'd like to, but now you've got this cellular TPM that's locking you into that service inadvertently.
Okay, but it doesn't sound like we have any evidence of this actually happening, the exemption impacting one of these sort of like large manufacturers or oil pipeline.
I don't have an example of that.
I don't have one at hand. I think it really is just too early in the development of this technology. So we may be in a situation we might contend now is too early. 3 years might be too late, just because this is moving so incredibly quickly. That's our client's concern.
With respect to sort of more consumer devices, which I think we had sort of, it seemed like you were more focused on those in part in your comment. Do you have any examples of consumer devices that individuals would want to unlock to switch carriers? Internet of Things devices?
Home security systems are the most frequently used ones that I would think of in commercial security systems.
And you said Nest. You give Nest as an example, or maybe this is.
Yeah, I don't know if Nest have a cellular connected. They're new. Yes, they do.
mean, mine does not.
Their new security system is.
T-Mobile is the exclusive cellular backup of the Nest.
Right, so that's one example of a cellular provider locking down an IoT device by saying we're the exclusive backup provider. This only came out in January, though, so there's just not much available out there, being that it's only been 3 months since they've been doing this for this particular example.
And I don't have an S, so this is more like a device that is not paired with a service. Is that right? It's less like OnStar and more like a. I know that Nest is a wireless.
Yes, so this
temperature
it's a
control.
security system, so it is paired with the service because the service is the security monitoring. So when they say Nest backup, that's the like we're going to call the police if your security system goes off, and so usually that's a monthly service that you're paying for.
So is this T-Mobile service something, if I was interested in buying it, I would, have my subscription through Nest and then I would separately pay T-Mobile for the backup service? Is that your understanding of how it's offered?
That's my understanding, yes. And just to be more clarify something I said earlier, we're talking about the Nest Secure So you're probably familiar with the Nest as a smart thermostat. This is a security system. So the Nest Secure is a Nest branded security system. That's what T-Mobile is claiming to be the exclusive backup provider for. I believe you would pay T-Mobile separately, and that's just based on my own review of T-Mobile's website. Not having signed up, I can't promise you that for certain, but that's sure how it looked to me.
So as we talk about all these different kinds of devices, one concern that the register had in the last rulemaking was that there just wasn't a sufficient evidentiary record for so many of these types of devices. And I think that that could be an issue in this record as well, just because there are so many devices that are sort of encompassed in the idea of the Internet of Things. So one thing we were thinking about is, are there categories of devices or are there qualitative descriptions of devices that we could grant an exemption for that would address, sort of like the most common issues. And so one potential category of devices would be portable devices. Do you think that does that meaningfully expand the scope of the exemption to address the types of devices you're concerned about?
I believe it would, yes. And the reason I say that is just because one thing we've thought a lot about were concerns that the NTIA raised during the 2015 rulemaking, that the line distinguishing a mobile phone from other devices is increasingly disappearing. And as the NTIA said, it really doesn't make a lot of sense for the size of the screen or the form of the device to be determinative here when I can surf the internet on my phone and I can make a call on my laptop. Why are we distinguishing as a matter of the DMCA? So our ask was wireless devices connecting to a telecommunications network. If, as you suggested, it was portable wireless devices that connect to a mobile telecommunications network, I think that would be a great step in the right direction and would make a lot more sense as we're having all these different kinds of devices that, what's a phone, what's a tablet, what's a laptop, that they all kind of blend together.
But are laptops locked? Because phones and tablets are already permitted.
Right, phones and tablets are already permitted. I'm not certain if
Right.
they are
Like
any
4G
exempt.
laptops. I don't know.
I think we concluded they were not in 2015, so I don't know if something has changed.
Yeah, I know of 4G laptops. I haven't looked to see if there are locks on them.
I mean, because I will sort of push back, Mr. Connolly. One reason that the Copyright Office has chosen to distinguish is it said that there could be an effect on the fourth factor under the fair use analysis, whether there's an effect on the market for the copyrighted works. And that may vary depending upon device and device. And there's really no treatment of that in the written comments, which are pretty thin. So it would be helpful if you could address that, because that's something the Copyright Office has suggested might affect the analysis of whether these uses are likely to be non-infringing, and why we've looked to specific examples, and concluded that many are likely to be non-infringing, but that is why we've looked at specific examples in the past.
Well, we do not believe that the analysis would differ based on the type of device. And the reason we say that is due to the nature of the copyrighted work, as you say in the fourth factor. The copyrighted work at issue here is the code that is involved in the locking on these TPMs. I'm not even sure what the market for that code or the market for a TPM looks like. So if we're talking about the market for a phone or for a laptop or for a tractor, that's not the copyrighted work itself. So we believe the fourth factor does favor granting this exemption, just because I haven't seen anyone come forward and say that the reason this exemption should not be granted is because of the effect on the market for the copyrighted TPM. That's just not what's at issue. It's business models of phones and laptops and farming devices, which is not the purpose of copyright law to govern.
One thing that might simplify this is to think about the actual copyrighted work that we're talking about, which is the baseband software that Qualcomm wrote that's on this device. It's the same licensing fee. It's the same product. It doesn't matter if it's in a tractor or a natural gas plant or in a cell phone or in a car. It's the same chip, and it's probably the same Broadcom part number and the same licensing fees, the same amount of money that Broadcom got paid. And you don't see Qualcomm here saying we oppose unlocking our devices in specific situations. They got paid. They're happy. They're going to get paid a lot more over the next 3 years.
So, are there any other sort of qualitative categories or descriptions that you think you've presented evidence on, enough evidence on to support an exemption, both with respect to the fair use factors and also the adverse effects of the current exemption?
I think portable devices was a great suggestion. I cannot think off the top of my head of any other ways I would craft that, but if the Copyright Office is inclined to grant a broader than existing but narrower than we've asked for exemption, we would certainly love the opportunity to maybe submit language, if that would be a possibility, trying to cabin this appropriately.
Do you think an exemption that included, or do you think that the fact that a consumer contracts with a carrier for the coverage is sort of like a characteristic that would qualitatively describe a meaningful category of devices? So not devices where you're paying GM or something, but where you're actually contracting with a carrier to get the coverage for the device.
I don't think so. That to me just feels like it's too reliant on contract law, which is really not what we, I think, want to see an exemption that focuses more on the devices themselves or on the technologies that devices use. I would have to think more about it. But yeah, I'm not sure. Can I even maybe pay some of these services prepaid or month to month? Would those not be covered by a contract? Those would be the sorts of concerns I would have.
If I'm a recycler, I'm getting products in. I wouldn't know necessarily what kind of arrangement was set up ahead of time. I just know I've got a device that has a SIM card in it. I want to be able to swap that out and sell it in Canada.
I guess maybe we can find a different example, but I'm back on the OnStar example, where you're not having a contract or relationship with the carrier directly. You're doing it through an intermediary, in that case, GM. Say you successfully unlock it and you switch something to a different carrier. Are you then able to still receive the OnStar services that you're no longer paying for?
I don't know enough about the technical implementation of OnStar to answer that. I would think, being a internet guy, I build internet services, and the car is an IP address on the internet, that it ought to be able to talk to any network out there. OnStar was kind of an early technology, and it may have some like funky proprietary way that they integrated that. But let's say there was some new kind of clean room you were building that today, or it was Tesla, for example, the way that they do their telematics. I would think it wouldn't matter what cellular connection it was talking over.
So in that case, it seems like before you've had to pay money to someone who is providing you a different service than the Broadcom lock, right? They're providing you whatever you get with OnStar, some of which might be copyrightable works, and now you're no longer paying for it because you've switched to a different server and sort of cut them out. Is that right?
Sure.
This has all been very fascinating. I want to go back to the portable that we talked about earlier. Portable is currently in the exemption, right? So I think under the exemption that was talked about, possibility there, I want to probe a little bit more on that, because if you just do portable devices, does that exclude the car that we're talking about now, the OnStar type device? Does that exclude that? But it includes the mobile hotspot. It sounds like that's integrated, which is not necessarily mobile or a portable device, right?
That's an excellent question.
We drove in the car here. We were moving it.
I would think cars
We
are
covered this in
portable.
2015.
We did cover
Well,
this
the car
in
is portable,
2015.
It is not in that way.
Right.
Therefore,
So I think that was an important point that we made in 2015, right? In this discussion was the definition of portable becomes very important here, right? So there's 4 categories currently listed, right? And a lot of what you're talking about here seems to be, if you come down and just say C, which is portable mobile connectivity devices, such as mobile hotspots, removable wireless broadband modems, and similar devices. That seems to me to be pretty broad here. So I'm not convinced entirely that some of the things you're listing aren't already included in that broad category as it's already listed. So you're talking about farm implement equipment, right? Those are portable devices that are put in the fields to measure whatever out there, right? The soil content or rain or whatever it might be, right? Those seem to be portable mobile connectivity devices, such as, which allows a lot of other things, and similar devices. Would that not be included in the current exemption?
And I'm sorry is the definition of car being portable being that like a human cannot lift it?
I think generally that's what we talked about last time, right? That you can't carry it in your pocket. But a lot of these portable devices that are in the fields,
A lot of the farm implements are not. I mean, it's like a 1,000-pound machine that you attach to a tractor.
That is the
Some farm implements or the tractor itself has a cellular connection in it.
So in those cases, those would be excluded if they're attached to the tractor or they're not a third-party device attached to the tractor. I think that's part of what I wanted to probe a little bit, because we talked about modems or other things, or not modems, but GPS devices. A lot of those are third-party devices that you connect, right? Those seem to fit into that portable category, and that seem to be within the current exemption now.
I think there's a need to unlock more devices than that. So an example, there's a company called Farm Mobile, and they make a attachment that plugs into a tractor that has a cellular modem in it that pulls the data off the tractor and sends it to the cloud, so the farmer can have the data on his iPad. They're effectively bypassing the cellular lock that's on the tractor, because the tractor already has a cellular modem. It's already providing all that data to John Deere, just like OnStar is providing it to GM. The only way that they were able to get around it was basically to add another cellular modem to the tractor that they control.
do you think that activity is already permitted by the current exemption for vehicles?
Depends on how specific your definition of TPM is in that. Does that include the cellular lock on the vehicle?
I mean, I just think it may be already permitted.
I think if you read the two together, right, and these aren't intended to be exclusive, right? If you say that you're allowed to do the TPM for the cellular lock, and then you're allowed to do it for the repair of the automobile, perhaps there's a way that those are working together already, without having this.
This one can be
language.
performed by third parties, and the other one cannot. Is that true? So that may be a difference.
Believe so.
I mean, it's really all about, can the farmer's mechanic do it for him? Right?
So this one includes, in the current language, undertaken by the owner of any device or by another person at the direction of the owner, right? Which seems to me, under the
on
way
this one, but not on the existing tractor.
on the existing tractor one, I think that's right. That's one of the proposed changes there.
We'll get to that Wednesday.
Yeah. So I don't think these are meant to be completely exclusive. In other words, if they could work together, why not, right?
Sure. But then I would encourage drafting this in such a way that it would include the tractor.
So you would include more than just portable devices?
I would. Yes.
So is there a
what,
definition for something like that we could do? I'm sorry, talking about.
Well, I'd go to the language that they suggested in their file. It should be all wireless devices.
but is there language that you think if we weren't, if we didn't feel we had the record to make that change, is there a language that you would suggest that would encompass the kind of farm or agricultural devices that you're talking about?
I don't think we have specific language picked out for the specific examples that we offered. Of course, we are using these as examples of IoT devices that demonstrate that we need it for all devices. We would like the exemption to be expanded to as many devices as possible. So we're just seeking the most expansive language reasonable.
And I appreciate that. Sometimes it's hard in these cases where you come in and say all IoT devices. The imagination is amazing here, right? There's a lot of things that are available. So that makes it hard to figure out what's in this category, right? So a lot of your uses seem to be industrial or farm-related uses. Would that be a way to define this category that would be satisfactory? So that you think about half of your categories are all fit in something like that, industrial or farm type uses. Would that be something that would be satisfactory here?
I think that could be one of the categories we'd like to see. We'd also be very interested in a category such as consumer electronics. I think probably that's even more so important to our client than the industrial uses, but it is very difficult to think of how to draft this to catch what we want to catch, and I sense the Copyright Office is not buying our suggestion of using the technology, the telecommunications network, using that as a cabining principle. But if we don't use that, then do we say consumer electronics and industrial IoT devices and agricultural IoT devices? We think that would be great. It's just very difficult, and that's with this expanding so quickly. It's just almost impossible to think of not only all the devices out there today, but all the devices that will be there in 2 years, 11 months. It's a rough job.
Can you speak in this agricultural example, which, I appreciate your hair, Mr. Weens, but this was not in ISRI's papers. This is the first we're hearing of it, right? Where you say it is locking something to go to an iPad and you'd like to divert it to have a, I guess, aftermarket competitor? Is it taking data? Is it taking copyrighted material? What is being unlocked or what is being used after there's unlocking?
Sure. So this is wireless telemetry. So when we talk about telematics on Wednesday, this is data coming off of the vehicle. In the case of a agricultural implement, it is actual data that's relative to how the farm or how the machinery is operating on the field. So, for example, if you have the RPM of a tractor over time on the field, that can give you information you need to calculate soil density. And that soil density is very helpful for planting seed and pesticide spraying and all kinds of other things. So that information is available to farmers in John Deere's online portal, and you have to pay a monthly fee on top of your purchase of the tractor for access to their online portal. There's a huge amount of innovation that people would like to perform on top of that, in addition to what John Deere has done, but they're a locked Apple-style ecosystem, and so that's where Farmobile comes in, creates an alternative ecosystem, and pipes all of that data that's coming live off the tractor. We had I was talking with a farmer who was using this system, and he was looking at, it was actually feeding real-time data of the amount of grain that was in the hoppers. And he was looking at it, the number wasn't going up, and he knew his son was out in the field collecting grain, and the amount of grain that was in the hopper wasn't going up, and he thought something is broken with the sensor. Went out in the field, and it turns out his son left the gate open on the back of the hopper, and all the grain was just spilling out onto the field. It's an example of very useful real-time information that was the kind of innovation that Deere didn't provide, but that Farmobile was able to.
So I think that's useful, but that is also probably a sign that we're veering too much into the,
Sure.
the automobile vehicle, so we should maybe conclude this one and we'll look forward to picking that part up again on Wednesday.
If I could leave one final thought, it would be, I'm not seeing, we're trying to provide evidence of all these different areas. We're not seeing harm that is caused by people bypassing this particular lock. I would argue that this is a lock that, in the benefits of society, is almost best if it's always bypassed. So if you're thinking about where should the burden of proof fall, let's look at where is the signs of societal damage that has been caused by people unlocking cell phones, cellular modems.
Right, anything else? No? Great, thank you very much for
Thank
all
you.
your
Thank you.
perspectives.
Thank you.
Thank you.